I, Corlys Velaryon.
As you probably know by now, Corlys Velaryon is black. His children, too, and I think that's his brother right there on the left. As you probably also know, this casting choice has drawn the predictable outrage from, well, the same people who always object to any perceived increase in diversity when it comes to casting choices. I mean, who could forget the Liet Kynes controversy, or James Bond, or when they cast Annie, that's right, Annie, the orphan girl, as a black actress in a Broadway play. That caused quite the stir from people who probably never had strong feelings about Annie. In any case, as usual, these folks have formed very strong opinions before they've even seen the show or movie in question, which in this case is House of the Dragon. That's unfortunate because, as I'll explain, Black Velaryons actually make a ton of sense. Of course, knee-jerk backlash to Black Velaryons isn't really about sense. And to be honest, many of these types of commenters are very free and open with their racism and hostility, and I've been deleting a couple such ugly comments per day since I released my first video on House Velaryon. And you've probably seen similar types of ugliness in the comments section of basically any video or social media post about the Velaryons, and Corlys in particular. However, I'm not here to talk to those folks, as they've already set themselves against the show, and as I've already given my unvarnished opinion on this dynamic of modern media consumption in the House Velaryon, House of the Dragon preview livestream, which you can find in the House of the Dragon playlist. Also, quick shout out to Gray Area, who breathed dragon fire all over this topic in this video, which I've linked below and which I highly recommend and 100% stand by. What I am here to talk about is how Black Velaryons will work with the established canon and the story in Fire and Blood. In the end, any change that you make when you're adapting a story will be judged on how well it works for the story. Whether that's changes to the ethnicity or age of a character, or changes to important dialogue or plot beats. I myself was pretty excited when I saw the casting of Black Velaryons for several reasons. I mean, it's simply a fact that fantasy has always been overly white and has in general painted an inaccurate picture of the medieval world as racially homogenous, and a course correction is long overdue. There are also tons of black Game of Thrones fans, especially in Targ Nation, shout out Targ Nation. So including black dragon lords in Game of Thrones just seems intuitive and natural. Now, the potential to learn more about places that we haven't been to, like the Summer Islands, is exciting, and as we'll discuss, the way that this casting choice will interact with the book canon is potentially very interesting. Plus, Corlys and the rest of House Velaryon just look really damn cool, and it's just, I don't know, it's just hard for me to understand people looking at these pictures and making a frowny face. Unless, well, you know. So how's this going to work? Well, click the like and subscribe button, and I'll tell you about the two choices that I can see the show going with. So like I said, there would seem to be two choices in general that the show can make in regards to explaining how Corlys Velaryon became black, if you will. I think one choice makes a little more sense than the other, but both are interesting and both could work, so I'll give you the rundown on each, as well as a potential clue that I found in the casting list that may indicate which way they're going. So essentially, the choices here are that the Velaryons have always been black, dating back either to the days of Valyria or to their early years on Driftmark, or that one of Corlys's parents was a Summer Islander, likely his mother. Of course, black and white are terms that aren't used in A Song of Ice and Fire, but for all intents and purposes, black people in A Song of Ice and Fire are from the Summer Islands, which are very loosely modeled on African and Caribbean culture, with a little bit of the maritime skill of the Pacific Islanders. The Summer Isles are an isolated archipelago a good bit south of Westeros, which can be reached by ship fairly easily, almost like a jumbo-sized Hawaiian Islands, or like the Caribbean islands if they were floating by themselves in the middle of the ocean. The Summer Islanders are the world's foremost mariners, but instead of navigating the ocean in smaller canoes and rafts like the Pacific Islanders, they instead build the largest ships in the world, which are called swan ships, after their white sails, and their mastheads, which are often carved in the shape of a swan or other bird. They are a largely peaceful people who thrive on trade and, as such, can be found in every port city around the world. You'll probably remember Sam running into Summer Islander ship captain Koja Mo in Bravos, whom he hitched a ride with all the way to Old Town, and him and Gilly and the fat pink mast, and, well, surely you remember all of that. In any case, you may also recall that Dany traded news with a Summer Islander ship captain in Karth named Kahuru Mo. So Karth and Bravos, obviously both port cities that are hubs of international trade. So this sets up a fairly intuitive way to connect House Velaryon and the Summer Isles, because the Velaryons are in turn Westeros' most skilled mariners, who have also grown wealthy off of international trade. Driftmark, stronghold of House Velaryon, has in turn become a thriving port city and a hub of international trade. Frequent contact between Summer Islanders and Velaryons is therefore not only logical, but extremely likely or even inevitable. And we all know that when humans have contact, they will sometimes fall in love and start a family. If you think about it, Velaryons and Summer Islanders would potentially run into each other in three ways. When a Summer Islander visits Driftmark for reasons of trade, when a Velaryon sails to the Summer Isles for reasons of trade, or they could also meet at literally any port city in the world, since they're both venturing out to the far reaches of the globe, seeking out goods they can buy and sell for a profit. A shared love of the sea and a shared lifestyle could easily serve as the basis for mutual respect and admiration, so I would think that romantic relationships would happen on occasion. Or certainly they could, which is kind of the point. Thus, the most logical way that House of the Dragon might fill out the Velaryon backstory is simply to say that one of Corlys's parents, neither of whom are named in the books by the way, was a Summer Islander. It would probably be his mother, so as to facilitate someone from outside House Velaryon marrying into House Velaryon, thus leaving Corlys with the last name of Velaryon.
I, Corlys Velaryon,
And the rights to inherit Driftmark as Lord of the Tides. Corlys would then be the beneficiary of not one, but two sets of advanced seafaring knowledge, setting him up to become the boldest and most accomplished mariner in the history of Westeros, which is exactly what he was. Perhaps Corlys's many long and successful voyages east were aided by his having been able to call upon contacts made by Summer Islanders around the world. I mean, it's easier to think you can sail to ET and make a fortune if your uncle or third cousin or whatever has already been there and tells you, yeah, just look up so-and-so on the West Docks and tell him I sent you. I mean, I'm just speculating here, obviously, but the whole point is to point out the ways in which making Corlys Velaryon a Summer Islander provides very interesting avenues to flesh out the world, and Corlys's backstory in particular. So instead of Corlys just being a regular noble from House Velaryon, he becomes this more complex character with a story rooted beyond the shores of Westeros. And that fits very well for a man whose later deeds are intrinsically tied to the east and the far-flung reaches of the world. It also gives House of the Dragon a chance to add a little more depth and substance to the Summer Isles, to flesh out their story, since they weren't developed very much in the main books of A Song of Ice and Fire. With several seasons of House of the Dragon to come and a potential Corlys Velaryon spin-off show in the works, I would think at some point we'll be visiting the Summer Isles, and now you can really see the benefits here. We can go to a whole new place, very exotic location, very different from everything else that we've seen on a Game of Thrones. I mean, come on, who's not for that? Visiting the Summer Isles. In fact, the show could even invent a more detailed link between the Velaryons and the Summer Isles. Perhaps they've been each other's favorite trade partners for decades now, with every young Velaryon making a trip to the Isles when they're first learning to sail. Maybe that's like a rite of passage, sailing all the way to the Summer Isles and back to Driftmark, right? I mean, it's either that or sail to Valeria or the Basilisk Isles, so the Summer Isles make a little more sense. If the show does go with a backstory that involves this kind of longer-running connection, then it could be that more than one Velaryon has married a Summer Islander. Now, some people have raised the question of the actor that plays Corlys, Steve Toussaint, having skin that is too dark for someone with one black parent and one white parent, though again, people in Westeros don't use the terms black and white, of course. It's probably the case that the show just isn't worried about this. After all, mixing genes isn't like mixing paint, but rather the complex and somewhat random combination of the many, many genetic traits of the two parents. A child of a light-skinned Velaryon and a Summer Islander could have skin tones and other physical traits along a fairly broad range. To the extent that they're thinking about this, it could be that they're reasoning that Corlys' Summer Islander mother had very, very dark skin. After all, the tones of the Summer Islanders are described as ranging from, quote, nut brown or teak to ebony and polished jet, with ebony, of course, being a type of wood that is basically black streaked with dark brown, and polished jet being, of course, a shiny pitch black gemstone. All that is to say that I don't really think there's an issue if it turns out that it's only Corlys' mother who is from the Summer Isles. However, as I mentioned, it could also turn out that there's a longer-running link between Driftmark and the Isles, and that Corlys Velaryon's parent wasn't the first to marry a Summer Islander, and was himself already biracial. So that's the first option, the Corlys has a Summer Islander parent option. The other option is something along the lines of, the Velaryons have always been black, or at least for a very long time. This presents somewhat of a greater challenge for continuity with the established lore, but it's not to say that it can't work, or that it wouldn't be interesting. So the Velaryons, of course, are a Westerosi house with roots in the old freehold of Valyria. We don't know exactly when they came to Driftmark, only that it was some time before the Targaryens came to Dragonstone, which was about 114 years before Aegon's conquest and 12 years before the doom of Valyria. Dragonstone itself was established as a Valyrian outpost about 200 years before that, so it's possible that the Velaryons came to Driftmark around that time, and may well have been in Westeros for as much as 2 centuries before the Targaryens came there. We can't be sure if the Velaryons were one of the famous 40 families whose leaders were designated Lords Freeholder that dominated Valyrian politics, but it's very likely that they were not, simply based on the fact that they relocated to Driftmark away from the center of power in Valyria, and because we are told that they were never dragon riders, and the most powerful Valyrian families were all dragon riders. In this, the Velaryons are different from their Targaryen cousins, whose dragons were, quote, bred for war, going back to the days of Valyria. Even possessing dragons, though, Targaryen was apparently not a very powerful political force in Valyria. And with Valyrian politics being very much inward-looking and centered on Valyria, the Targaryens and Velaryons, as well as the Celtigars, the third Westerosi house of Valyrian descent, would have been giving up whatever political power they had when they moved west. The Velaryons, Targaryens, and Celtigars, however, came to dominate the trade of the Narrow Sea in the century before the Doom, with the Velaryons and Celtigars controlling the sea lanes and the Targaryens the skies above. And by the way, the fact that House Velaryon has the name Velaryon, which sounds so much like Valyrian, could be a clue that the first Velaryon was somebody of very low birth in Valyria, somebody who didn't even have any kind of noble house name, but instead was just called the Velaryon when he first showed up to Driftmark and started building up his new house from nothing. Because it really doesn't make sense that a house in Valyria would be called Velaryon. Would just be very confusing, right? It also seems likely that the Velaryons' seafaring skill predates their move to Driftmark, since moving to Driftmark to try your hand at trade is probably something you do when you already have some amount of power at sea. So, could the Velaryons have been black, meaning part Summer Islander, going all the way back to Valyria? Well, yes, for a couple of reasons. First of all, Valyria is a huge empire encompassing the lands of many cultures. And even though Valyria committed genocide and enslaved many of those cultures, that wasn't always the case. Thus, many non-Valyrian-blooded people did in fact live inside the empire and would have become citizens of the empire. And also people from other places visited Valyria because it was kind of the cultural center of the world at that time. Maesters, scribes from Yi, and of course, traders would have all visited Valyria, and thus some intermarriage would have absolutely occurred between Velaryons and non-Velaryons. We never hear about a Valyrian law against interracial marriage, for example, and the Velaryons were known to tolerate all religions inside their empire, being polytheistic themselves. We are, of course, told that many Valyrian dragonlord families, such as Targaryen, did practice familial incest in order to maintain their monopoly on the genes which facilitate dragon riding. But of course, the Velaryons wouldn't have had that motivation, since they were never dragon riders. In any case, what all this means is that should the writers of the show, and George Martin, who is of course heavily involved with House of the Dragon, decide to go in a direction like this, they could decide that the Velaryons were already sailing the wide world and marrying with people of other lands, the Summer Islands specifically, before they ever came to Driftmark. Similarly, it could be that the Velaryons developed trade relations with the Summer Isles shortly after relocating to Driftmark as they became more powerful, or perhaps after the Doom wiped out Valyria and threw the balances of world politics and trade into temporary chaos. Point being, either scenario creates a situation where the Velaryons may have developed a kind of custom, if you will, of seeking out wives from the Summer Islands on occasion, similar to the way the Starks have married into the houses of their top vassals on multiple occasions throughout history. And thus, you'd have an entire house of Black Velaryons, if you will, as opposed to just Corlys. So the major challenge to the canon here is that House Velaryon, of course, married into House Targaryen before the birth of the conquerors Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys. Valyna Velaryon was the mother of the conquerors, and Valyna herself had one Velaryon parent and one Targaryen one. These intermarriages are very important for the plot of House of the Dragon because they are part of what establishes House Velaryon as worthy partners for the princes and princesses of the Targaryen royalty. And the slights to House Velaryon in the decades before the dance are, of course, a big factor in the breakout of the war proper. Those intermarriages really can't be written out of the story, in other words, so if the Velaryons were already Black at this time, that essentially changes the way that Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys look. That's not really a problem, since these are fictional characters, of course, but this might be a change they don't want to make since everyone in the fandom has been looking at fan art of those three for about 2 decades. Corlys Velaryon, the Sea Snake, on the other hand, well, there's really only 2 or 3 pieces of art from him before House of the Dragon that I could even find. So this really isn't a character that anyone could picture in their minds, and we're never even given his physical description, in fact, in contrast to the detailed descriptions of the 3 conquerors. Now again, if the show decides that it does have an interesting backstory for how the entire House Velaryon became Black, perhaps along the lines of what I've suggested, then they may just decide that in this version of the canon, Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys were a little more tan than we've all been picturing them. I mean, those characters aren't on the show after all, so it's really not even something they'd have to address, just something that's implied. Now, as I mentioned, there is a clue that the showrunners and George Martin are going to go with the first option, the Corlys's mom is from the Summer Isles option, which is this fella right here, Sir Vaemond Velaryon. He has a somewhat minor but not insignificant role to play in the events of House of the Dragon, and in the books, he is Corlys's cousin. However, the House of the Dragon HBO website lists him as the younger brother to Corlys Velaryon and commander in the Velaryon Navy, which is a change that you might make if it's only Corlys's mom that was a Summer Islander. They might have made the change from cousin to brother for some other reason, but the obvious reason is simply to highlight Corlys and Vaemond's Summer Islander parent, which again I presume to be their mother. So with all that said, there's still a couple of questions to address about how Summer Islander Velaryons will affect the story of House of the Dragon proper. Namely, will they be subjected to racism, and how does this change affect the Rhaenyra and Laenor's children are probably strong bastards plotline? As to the first, the answer is perhaps a little, but probably not too much. The more modern concept of colorism, which is racism or bigotry purely based on skin tone, is really not something we see anywhere in the world of A Song of Ice and Fire, let alone in Westeros. And there are no derogatory epithets that refer to skin tone that we've ever heard of in the books. The Summer Islanders aren't derided with such epithets, for example, when they visit King's Landing or some SOC port city where the people are pale-skinned and in fact descended from Valyria, such as Lys or Volantis. Now, what we do hear about is some level of prejudice or bigotry against the Dornish on the part of the rest of Westeros. But this, again, isn't based on colorism, as the Dornish range from, like, say, Mediterranean darker looks to the very pale looks of the Danes and the other so-called stony Dornish in the mountains. That's my kind of Dornishman, by the way, the stony Dornishman. He's less likely to stab you with the Grateful Dead tunes jamming in the background, but I digress. One of the factors that inflamed the Blackfire Rebellion, the first one, was actually antipathy towards the Dornish, as Daeron II Targaryen had taken a Dornish princess to wife, Mariah Martell, as a means of bringing Dorne into the kingdom, which caused some resentment from certain other High Lords. Some complained that their children were too Dornish-looking, if you will, but this again seems to stem from antipathy towards the ferocious and recalcitrant Dornish people, as opposed to some sort of Westerosi colorism. Because again, some of the Dornish are in fact not only pale-skinned, but blonde-haired and blue-eyed because of Andal blood. The idea that the Targaryen claim to monarchy in part flowed from their being perceived as godlike may have also been a factor, with their signature Valyrian looks being a part of that, but this is pretty weak, to be honest. Targaryen claims to monarchy mostly have to do with their dragons. And Baelor Breakspear, the too Dornish-looking son of Daeron II and Mariah Martell, eventually became the favorite son of the realm due to his character and his valor. So, on the whole, I wouldn't expect to see much of anything that looks like modern, anti-black racism on the show. The comments are another matter, like I said. I'll just delete that one right there. Click, click. And actually, to be honest, there really aren't too many of those comments. It's just that the ugly ones stand out quite a bit. But on the whole, the fandom has been pretty cool, at least on my YouTube page. So thanks, everyone. I appreciate that. Now, with all that said, the Velaryons being passed over for the throne on multiple occasions is, of course, a major plotline. And although there are already plenty of reasons for why this occurred, the showrunners could decide to imply that some level of resistance to, say, Laenor as king is due to dislike of his Summer Islander ancestry, which may simply be seen as foreign to Westeros, similar to the way that Daeron's Dornish marriage was held against him by people who, by the way, already had political or personal reasons to oppose him. So the second question, Rhaenyra and Laenor's children, who again are implied as almost certainly the children of Rhaenyra and Harwin Strong. In the books, the paternity seems obviously wrong because all three children have brown hair like Harwin and facial features that seem to resemble those of House Strong, which is kind of hard to explain given that Rhaenyra and Laenor both have silvery Valyrian hair and typical aquiline Valyrian features. Now that Laenor has been cast to be played by a black actor on the show, with somewhat lighter skin compared to Corlys or even his sister, you'll notice, people will suspect that they aren't Laenor's kids when none of them come out with curly hair or slightly darker skin. So essentially, nothing is really different. They're pretty obviously not Laenor's kids in either scenario, with a slight window of doubt. Because, of course, in the book canon, Rhaenys, the queen who never was, is half Baratheon and has black and silver mixed hair. So maybe the Strong children have darker hair that they got from their grandmother as opposed to Harwin, but it's a pretty thin thread. Similarly, it's possible that children of Rhaenyra and a somewhat lighter-skinned Laenor could come out looking essentially white, but all three of them that's less likely, right? So like I said, nothing really changes. They're pretty obviously not Laenor's kids in either scenario, and King Viserys and Rhaenyra on the show will probably have to use threats in order to silence the rumors, just as in the books. So that's pretty much it. As you can see, there's a couple different ways the showrunners could go. There's a couple different options for the story writing, maybe some that I even haven't thought of, and if you've thought of anything that I've missed, then please leave a comment below. Obviously, I'm white, so if there's anything I missed or was insensitive about, let me know about that in the comments, and I'll try to do a little better. But I hope you like my coverage of the issue, and there you go. There you have it. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you again real soon with another House of the Dragon video.